Welcome back to another Reddit readings video. If you enjoy these stories, don't be scared to leave a like. Now, do be scared. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. A midnight visitor in a cabin in the woods. This is a true story. Every time I tell it, it pulls the eyes of everyone in the room. I'm not sure why I haven't posted it before, but upon reflecting with a friend, I decided it was time to share. In the summer of 2020, my friends, Alex and Violet, and I decided to go on a mountain vacation. COVID cabin fever had hit us hard and we were desperate to get out. We settled on a mountain estate and planned to camp and hike at several different locations. For one night, we thought it would be fun to book a cabin in the woods. Violet's parents had rented a fire tower once and loved it, but a cabin beside a fire tower was all we could find. It was cheap, clean, and secluded. Excited to have a night where we could be as obnoxious as we wanted, we booked it. In the weeks leading up to the trip, we decided it would be a great idea to drop acid at the cabin. Violet bought an entire sheet in preparation for our arrival, and it was tucked in her bag as we pulled out of the driveway to make our way to the cabin. I remember this knot in the pit of my stomach, this aching feeling that gnawed at me. I told Alex and Violet that there was no way we could drop acid that night. Violet was pissed. We turned around and got into a massive argument, but I stood my ground. I just knew that we had no business tripping that night. Finally, the fireworks settled and we were off. The cabin was roughly 30 minutes away from the nearest town. It sat atop a mountain. We held our breath as we rounded the busted road that spiraled toward the top. There were no pull-offs, no other campsites, just a long, winding road that led us to the cabin at the peak. We settled in and started a fire to keep warm. As dusk gave way to night, we heard the unmistakable noise of an engine on the road, then the flash of headlights. A side-by-side with 3 kids arrived and our nerves settled. They smiled, gave us a wave, climbed the fire tower, and left. We'd heard there may be occasional visitors to the fire tower, but they were the only ones who'd come by. We doused the fire and moved inside, heated some hot dogs until they were lukewarm, ate them fast, and sat in the silence. You don't know how quiet it is until you're in the middle of nowhere. You can hear every rustle of the leaves, the whisper of the wind through their branches. You get so used to white noise. Living in the city, there's always the hum of an air conditioner or the dim roar of traffic to focus on. Here, the closest thing to white noise was the sound of our own breathing. We jumped at every noise, too frightened to speak to one another, and finally, I'd had enough. I cracked a few wine coolers, passed them to Alex and Violet, and slapped a board game down on the table between our bunk beds. It didn't take long for us to loosen, and we were laughing, having the raucous good time we'd envisioned. Much sober than we'd thought, but enough that we were able to ignore the rumble of the woods. Later, we'd all recall hearing noises in the background, the snap of a twig. None of us wanted to rupture the air of nonchalance between us, so we ignored it, until a human hand reached up to the window between us and slapped it 3 times. We were screaming in an instant. Alex called 911, put them on speakerphone, and handed his cell to me. He grabbed pokers from the fireplace and passed them out. Violet started calling family members and saying her last goodbyes. I held my breath and listened for any more noise. Whoever this was, whatever this was, would have heard us call 911, and now they were being careful to make a silent retreat. Dispatch arrived 20 minutes later, a lucky thing for a 1 a.m. emergency call, and had their dogs comb the mountain. Nothing. They suggested it may have been a bear, but I could tell from their faces that they didn't believe that for a second. We'd barely cooked those hot dogs, and why would a bear smack the window by a couple of screaming kids rather than the one closest to the pan we'd used to cook? Why would a bear knock on the window like a human? Why, when we screamed, did the bear make a stealthy retreat? They had no answers, but they had one anecdote. As they'd sped to us, they'd come across a car at the base of the mountain, but that was the only sign of life they'd seen. I remember my blood ran cold, but Violet and Alex were too frazzled to absorb the weight of what they'd said, and dizzy by a new horror. Violet's car, thoroughly dusted by our drive up the mountain, was covered in handprints. Handprints that didn't match ours, that touched places we hadn't. We grabbed our shit by the armful and threw it inside, eager to remove every part of ourselves from this mountain. We followed the police, grateful every pothole found us further and further from that wretched cabin. We made it down in record time and found lodging at a seedy hotel that reeked of cat piss. I couldn't sleep. The thought of that car on the road rang in my head. Remember, there was nothing else on that mountain. It was a narrow road to the top, no pull-offs, no other campsites. There was the fire tower. Maybe a visitor decided to spook us during their late-night excursion. But the kids from earlier, we'd seen their headlights. Whoever did this had stopped their vehicle further down the road and hiked the rest of the way. They didn't want to be spotted. They wanted silence, secrecy. Whoever this was hadn't been looking for a cheap scare. They'd planned this. I don't think I'll ever know what the person on the mountain wanted from me. I don't know if it was a practical joke or the beginning of a night of terror. I'm grateful for Alex's quick wit in calling 911. I wonder if our visitor knew we had service. It had certainly been a welcome surprise to us. Perhaps there was a wrench in his plan, enough to spook him before he could make things ugly. In truth, I don't know if I want to know. I think I'm just content to say, midnight stranger, let's not meet. My husband has a weird addiction that I think only applies to him. Whenever my husband latched onto some daft new fad, I really just had to strap myself in and sit under that dark storm cloud until his interest finally waned. For example, on Monday, Glenn might have returned home from the supermarket with 6 bottles of olive oil that he'd guzzled by the spoonful because it helped stabilize blood sugar. Then, by Thursday, he'd have moved on to lathering Manuka honey over everything for the antibacterial properties, never mind the fact it cost 85 pounds a fucking jar. His latest fad started with a tennis ball, of all things. While out walking our pet beagle, Toto, Glenn bet I couldn't clear the fence some 50 yards away. I made it soar clean past that point, but then Toto took off after the projectile, burrowed his way beneath the closest post, and disappeared. Great fucking job, Pete, Glenn snapped, his angry forehead wrinkle making itself known. As I jogged away backwards, I threw my hubby a shit-eating grin. Enjoy cleaning those dishes, bitch. I got halfway over the post before deciding it was too slippery, but climbing back down, my finger snagged. There was a sharp tug with zero pain, and when I looked down, my first thought was, oh great, Glenn's gonna make a scene. Don't freak out, I said, once he finally caught up, breathless. But I need you to call an ambulance. My ring finger had become completely degloved. Only the tendon remained attached to the knuckle. To my surprise, Glenn didn't hyperventilate at the sight of all the juicy blood. He just stared fixedly at the lonesome digit slowly rotating in front of my waist, a bungee jumper hanging from a cord. A passing nurse bandaged me up while we waited for the paramedics, who doped me up with some seriously good shit. At the hospital, a doctor drove a needle into my mangled finger base. Even with all those painkillers, it stung like a pissed-off hornet. 3 days later, I got discharged and sent home. 1 digit lighter, Toto got found by a cute couple with an adorable 8-year-old daughter who cried when she learned her new best friend already had owners. As the father handed him over to me on their front porch, he said, damn kid's heartbroken. Her and Toto played with a stupid rope toy for 3 hours straight last night. The doctors warned me I might need therapy to cope with the amputation. But honestly, the trauma of losing a finger wasn't nearly so bad as the inconvenience of having a spouse who endlessly talked about losing a finger. Don't take this the wrong way, I said one evening, as we sat down to a dinner of smoked salmon and Manuka honey, but can we please go 10 minutes without mentioning phantom pains or tissue death? Fine, except it wasn't actually fine. Glenn could be louder than a blender without uttering a single word. And from the pursed lips and narrow eyes, you could tell he was desperate to discuss some obscure study about limb detachment by some fringe scientist in Denmark. Why is it always the Danes? Go on then, I sighed. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, telling me about amputation, about how increased blood flow accelerates the healing of wounds. From there, he pivoted to Olympic athletes and how they extract and re-inject their blood to boost red cell concentration. You see what I was up against. The next morning, as I shuffled into the bathroom, my eye happened across this big purple plum wrapped around Glenn's toothbrush. When pressed, Glenn held his hand behind his back and tried to distract me by insisting I should read the 500-page study he WhatsApped me. Using my height, weight advantage, let's just say the kids in my English class didn't call me Grizzly Adams for nothing. I wrestled Glenn's hand out of hiding. A string was tied around the base of his forefinger, so tight the digit had inflated to triple its regular size. It quickly deflated once I pulled the thread loose. Why can't you sign up for a gym membership like a regular person? I asked. Of course, the love of my life had his comeback ready, because running and weightlifting are terrible for your body. Didn't you know pro athletes all wind up with artificial knees by their early 40s? If they're not already dead, that is. I blamed his father for the whole horrible mess. All those weight jokes had burrowed deep inside Glenn's psyche, embedding themselves like a tick. This was simply the manifestation. For the next few weeks, every time he opened his mouth, it was a fountain of pure arse gravy, a tidal wave of diarrhea more pungent than the bathroom during that week when he ate nothing except sardines and rhubarb. He told me our bodies had a concentration of minerals and that scientists in California had figured out how to focus them. Neanderthals understood this stuff back when mankind truly engaged with nature. And anytime I said, "Why not come with me to Weight Watchers?" he'd sob and bring up the time an attendant at Disney World told him he was too heavy to ride Space Mountain, and he had to watch as his entire family got on without him. He was 27 that day. Later one night, the fire alarm started screeching. I reached over and flicked on the porcelain lamp Glenn's aunt left us, the one with the French aristocrat figurine whose eyes tracked you across the room. Quickly we pulled on our robes and scrambled to rescue Toto. Fortunately, after a few minutes of complete terror, we realized the alarm was caused by faulty wiring and settled back down. And to think, we'd already had that bastard electrician out 6 times. As I climbed back into bed grumbling about a refund, it hit me how, during the mad panic, Glenn only wrestled one arm through the sleeve of his robe. When I ripped the blanket away, I saw a limp, blue appendage sprawled across my husband's torso. A rope was tied around his arm, just beneath the deltoid. Fuck knows how he managed the knot by himself. The two of us argued around the house, his arm flapping about like an out-of-control firehouse. After finally giving in and loosening the knot, he shivered his fingertips a half-inch or so. "See, you're getting worked up over nothing." He threw me a cheery smile like the argument was finished. "No need for these over-the-top theatrics, darling." That felt a little condescending from the guy who sobbed loud enough to get us kicked out of Marley and Me. Over the next month, I'd ask him to fetch a tin opener from the middle drawer. Then he'd awkwardly paw at the handle, his hands pale and useless because he'd been sitting on them for hours. And occasionally he'd limp out of the bathtub with a red ring beneath his kneecap. Then I'd discover twine clogging up the drain. Once it became clear this nonsense wasn't simply another flash-in-the-pan craze, I gave him an ultimatum: me or the bullshit. What did he do? He crammed his belongings into a suitcase and marched straight out the door. From then on, I could only keep tabs on him through the scale readings and selfies posted on Instagram. Each post accompanied by a mountain of hashtags. Hashtag weight loss, hashtag weight loss journey, hashtag healthy lifestyle, hashtag motivation. Note the words fitness and diet don't appear anywhere on that list. As he went from 127 kilograms to 115 to 105, his following grew. "You can do it. So proud of you. You've inspired me with my journey." I texted him ferociously, begging him to come up to for air, but he never responded. Little by little, oddities crept into the selfies. They started as full-body mirror pics, soon switching to extreme angles where you couldn't see below the chest, then only showed him from the neck up, and soon, not even that. Meanwhile, those figures continued to plunge. 94, 83. You couldn't lose that much weight if you cozied up to a damn tapeworm. I completely lost the plot and messaged him to come home immediately. Otherwise, we were through. I didn't want the police on my doorstep saying they found a rotted bag of skin and bones that I was once married to. After that exchange, his Instagram page got deleted and my calls went unanswered. 2 weeks later, in the middle of the night, a door shivered open downstairs. So I pulled on a robe and shouted Glenn into the darkened hall. No answer. I exited the room, feeling along the wall for the light switch that did nothing. Damn electrician. Dread crept into the pit of my stomach as a voice called out from the lounge. It sounded like Glenn, only more guttural, the kind of sounds you make in a dentist's chair. I called out to him, receiving only a muffled "Pete" in reply. In the lounge, a trapezoid of moonlight was thrown across the floor by the bay window. In the direct center sat a figure perched on a wooden stool, its back to me. From the blonde hair, I could tell it was Glenn, only thinner. I let out a sigh of relief, crossed the room, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Okay, what the hell's going?" As my husband spun around, the words caught inside my throat. There was a gaping hole in the middle of his face, through which you could see the beginnings of a nasal passage. Beneath it, the lips were gone, as though they had succumbed to a flesh-eating bacteria. I retched. Before I could react, a hand shot out and plunged a needle into my neck. My gut churned uneasily as the room and all the furniture sloshed from side to side, and then I hit the floor, hard. Glenn rose, a plucked chicken wing poked through his left sleeve, capped by a rounded elbow infested with maggots. And the hand which had been holding the needle moments earlier only had 2 fingers and a thumb. The last thing I can remember was staring at a bare foot that ended in a perfectly straight line, as though somebody had sliced the rest off with a guillotine. I woke up staring at the bedroom ceiling, my arms raised and splayed out, wrists secured to the bedpost by a length of rope that bit down on the spongy flesh. The slack gave me about 6 inches of movement. I couldn't feel my toes. Oh fuck, did that maniac cut off my legs? What else had he cut off? I wriggled my nose, puckered my lips, did a few kegels, and then let out the deepest sigh of relief imaginable. Almost forgetting my dire situation, I squirmed from side to side, alternating between trying to shimmy and brute force my way out. I screamed even though I knew it wouldn't help since our closest neighbor was that partially deaf old lady who threatened to have Toto put down for pissing on her rose bushes. To my left, the door swung open, and then Glenn leaned into my window of vision, his exposed teeth chattering away as he promised things would be okay. The words came out all garbled because of those missing lips. "You sick fuck," I screamed. "You've cut off my legs." "Not yet," he replied, eyes gliding across my naked body. I craned my neck far enough to see past my waist. 2 hose clamps were fastened around my thighs, tighter than a python. There was a 2-inch recess where they plunged into the flesh. Past them, my toes had turned impossibly blue. Glenn promised things would be over soon. Every time he spoke, it took a little contemplation to deduce the words. "You'll feel so much better this way. Why are you doing this?" I screamed. Between bouts of hysteria, he launched into another tirade, excitedly raving about some fringe researcher who believed amputation makes you healthier because the blood has less distance to travel. Cut off an arm, the good bacteria in your gut produce extra iron. Lop off some fingers, and hey presto, lung capacity just increased by 14%. "You'll kill us both," I cried. "Don't be so dramatic. Look at me." He straightened up and struck a pose. "This treatment worked wonders. Glenn, you're killing yourself. Look at your arm. There's maggots everywhere. Shows what you know. Maggots only eat the dead skin. It's like a little exfoliation treatment." Glenn grabbed a pencil and stabbed it into my ankle. Only after a few seconds did I realize he was testing whether I had any feeling left. I faked a grimace, teeth rattling away. He smiled and said, "Almost ready," and with that, he disappeared into the hall. I thought Glenn's horrible, garbled voice was the most bone-chilling sound I'd ever heard, until a few minutes later when a metal whine rang out from the garage. He was testing the circular saw. With every available ounce of strength, I squeezed, pulled, and twisted, but before I could work myself loose, the door creaked open once again. A giant pool of sweat gathered beneath my bare ass. Here we go. Goodbye lefty, goodbye righty. You were always my favorite. A little ball of fur jumped up onto the bed and licked along my face. "Toto," I cried out, relieved. "Here boy, bite this rope." He stared blankly, tongue hanging from the corner of his mouth, until I said, "Get me out of here, then we'll go for a walk." The magic W word sent him into overdrive. Soon the knot around my left hand loosed enough for me to reach as far as the ugly lamp on the bedside table. But before I'd worked the other free, unsteady footsteps traveled along the stairs. My time had just run out. Left with no other option, I shooed Toto off the bed, lay flat, and held both arms against the headboard as though still pinned in place. Glenn stepped into the room, the circular saw pinched between the crook of his pencil eraser elbow and 2-fingered hand. "Toto, who let you out?" While he shooed my furry savior into the hall and closed the door with his foot, I forced myself to remain perfectly still, arms quaking. Glenn marched across the room and stood beside the bed, ready to carve me up like a Christmas turkey. The saw made a brutal hissing sound as it spun round and round. He handled it pretty well for someone with only 3 digits. Honestly, as he squatted into position, my hand shot out and seized his aunt's lamp. Then I sat up as far as my restraints would allow, swung the ugly figurine in a fierce arc, and smashed the heavy base across the top of my husband's skull. What happened next was a PSA on why you should never play with power tools. Glenn collapsed forward, the saw chewing through both the mattress and his neck, mere inches from the side of my exposed midriff. With his top half sprawled across the bed, Glenn's eyes rotated towards me, a ring of blades threaded through his jaw, the entire lower half of his face a torn rag with diagonal metal spokes shining through. Several minutes later, after a little negotiation, I worked my arms free. Then I rolled over onto the floor and crawled around the bed on my elbows, past the heap of amputated meat that hadn't quite died yet, and out into the hall, where Toto licked my face, eager to get on with that walk. At the hospital, the doctors and investigators insisted I didn't have a choice, and even Glenn's dad agreed. "That boy was fucking wild," he said, staring out the window. "I just don't understand why he couldn't have just signed up for a gym membership." "Who knows?" I replied, then wriggled my big toes. "Who fucking knows?" I found a zipper on the back of my neck. I found it by accident. I was putting my hair up, something I did almost every day. My hand brushed against something at the bottom of my hairline. It could have been a large skin tag. I finished tying my hair up and grabbed my phone so I could see the thing better. When I saw it, I wasn't sure what it was. It was too big for a skin tag, but not the shape of a tick or something foreign. I realized as I stared at it that it was the top of a zipper. It was darker than my skin tone. It was more like a rosy gray. I nervously reached behind me to touch it. It was smooth, as if made of metal, but it wasn't metal. It was skin, just not my skin. I was able to flip the zipper top up and down. It didn't hurt, but I expected it to. How long had it been there? I didn't notice it before. A rational person would have called a doctor, called someone, at least, but I was compelled to open it. I pulled the zipper down just a little bit. It still didn't hurt. As I pulled, zipper teeth emerged. No blood came out, but my skin began to peel apart. I knew I should stop. My fingers trembled as I pulled a bit more. The skin easily separated. The top was 2 inches below my hairline when I heard my husband wake up. I ran to the door and slammed it shut. I locked it, my breath coming quick. I didn't want him to see what I was doing. I knew, on some visceral but invisible level, that it was wrong. The zipper scared me. What was underneath the zipper scared me more. I heard him lumbering towards the bathroom. He turned the knob. "Leah, let me in. I have to pee." "I'm in here," I called, my voice shaking and off. "Can I just pee real quick?" He was barely awake. "No, go downstairs." He paused. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." I didn't mean to yell, but there it was. The silence that followed was heavy with hurt. He waited for a moment, maybe hoping for an apology or some sort of explanation. I gave him neither. Eventually, his footsteps sounded down the hall. I felt relief and fear in equal measures. After a few breaths, I returned to the mirror, my phone in my hand. When I was able to see the zipper again, a thick black liquid had begun dripping from the opening. It was too dark to be blood. I touched it. It was warm. The substance was sticky, stretching between my fingers. I brought my hand to my face, examining it closer. In the blood were small specks of gold and light. There were little cosmos within the ooze. Max pounded on the door. "Why aren't you answering me?" My eyes left my hand and went to the door. How long had I been standing there? "Stop ignoring me." "I'm not," I whispered. "What are you doing in there?" "Nothing," I whispered. I heard his body slump against the door. He was crying again. "How long are you going to punish me?" I wasn't punishing him. This wasn't about him. Why does he always think everything is about him? I was at the mirror again, pulling the zipper further down. The black liquid was mostly contained within the zipper, but droplets made their way down my back. Something large was pushing against my spine. I could see it, like a fetus's fist against a mother's stomach. It pressed outward, making my neck and back look bumpy. There was something in there, something that needed to come out. I pulled the zipper until it was down to my shoulders. I began to hear gurgling coming from the opening. For a moment, I thought spiders were pouring from the teeth, but I blinked and they were gone. I had never felt so scared and yet so compelled, obsessed. My hand shook so much I couldn't hold the zipper to pull it. A slick hand shot out of the opening, covered in the black substance. I screamed. The hand flicked off the substance, almost nonchalantly, and grasped the zipper. Max's voice penetrated the scene. "What is going on? Are you hurt?" I fell to my knees as the foreign hand pulled the zipper further. It was at my shoulder blades, then the middle of my back, and then the lower back. My skin was peeled forward like a cocoon. The hand withdrew inside me. After a few moments, a leg revealed itself, stretching out of my body like a dancer. Then another leg, bent backward, feet now on the floor. A figure completely emerged. It straightened itself. Long hair stuck to its body. I crawled away from it, terrified. My skin was still open and gushing the black substance onto the floor. I could still see cosmos in the ichor. The figure turned towards me. It was a woman, naked, bathed in black. She bent forward and smiled at me. "One more thing," she said in a voice I recognized. She reached over me, shoving her hand into the opening on my back. For the first time I felt pain. Her hand inside me felt like a hot knife. I tried to hold in my screams but didn't succeed. She rooted around for what felt like a lifetime. Finally, when I felt close to passing out, she removed her hand. And it was an axe. The axe was too large to have fit inside me. She slung it over her shoulder, still smiling. I heard my own breath, panting. I also heard the faint voice of Max from outside the door. He was begging, crying. He was knocking, pounding. The figure noticed too, her face turning towards the door. "Don't," I whispered. I knew what she wanted to do. I knew because it was what I wanted. She set the axe down and turned to the mirror, putting her hair up. She wiped the substance off her face. Without looking at me, she said, "Wait here. I'll take care of it." I gathered my knees to my chest, sobbing into them. She grabbed the axe. Unceremoniously, she unlocked the door and opened it. Max's voice was small as he said, "Leah." She closed the door behind her. My wife just told me she's pregnant, but I am not the father. My wife Emily is incredibly religious, from the jewelry she wears to her complete unwillingness to skip Sunday Mass. I have no issue with this, or at least I didn't at first. As per her request, we got married in a church, attended a preparatory program, and even waited until after the big day to have sex. I mean, sure, perhaps we rushed into it a bit. You'd be surprised how well withholding sex works when it comes to a proposal. Emily and I had only been going out, or courting as she insisted on calling it, for 6 months before I got on one knee and popped the question. To this day, I'm not entirely sure what my motivation was. On the one hand, Emily is great. She's beautiful, kind, caring, all that jazz. On the other hand, I feel that her devotion sometimes interferes with logical thinking. For example, she believes that masturbation is a surefire way to end up in hell. I remember this one with particular clarity after Emily walked in on me rubbing one out in the shower. There are other curiosities too, such as the idea that starvation or fasting brings you closer to God. Any negative occurrences are merely God's plan, and that even the possession of any kind of contraception is inherently evil. Now, before you say anything, I knew about that last one before we got married. Emily made it clear that she has always wanted to have children and that it would be the first order of post-wedding business. I conceded, as I have never been opposed to the idea of kids myself, although I didn't understand the rush either. I mean, why couldn't we wait a bit, see if we were at least sexually compatible? I got my wish in the end, but not at all in the way either of us had expected. After trying for several months, we went to see a doctor. That's how we found out that Emily wasn't able to conceive. She cried for weeks on end and bought stacks and stacks of books on infertility. Some pages are still stuck together with tears. But once it became clear that science was helpless, she turned to the one book that always solved all of her troubles. The Bible. "God has always answered my prayers," she said. "He'll answer this one too." Now, look, I understand. I really do. Everyone deals with grief differently, so I didn't bug her about it. Not even when she'd read it aloud for hours in bed when I had work in the morning. She prayed a lot too. What used to be a quick prayer before bed quickly turned into hour-long sessions of crying and whispering words unknown to me. However, instead of getting better, she started shrinking in front of my eyes. Her skin turned translucent and she looked like she'd dropped about 30 pounds since she'd found out I wasn't home during the day, so her rapid decline was even more apparent. "Honey, maybe you should see a doctor," I suggested after I came home one afternoon to find her hunched over the kitchen table. At first, I thought she was crying, but as she raised her head to look at me, I realized my mistake. Her face was a light shade of green and her lips were covered in dried skin-colored gunk. She looked like she hadn't slept a wink the previous night. "Emily, oh my God." I charged toward her and cupped her face in my hands. "What happened?" She didn't answer immediately, swaying dangerously from side to side, as though she was about to pass out. I have some good news," she whispered eventually, brushing her fringe away from her clammy forehead. "I just feel really sick." With that, she slid off her chair and bolted towards the bathroom, slamming the door behind her. I could hear gargled retching and thumping coming from inside. "Emily," I called again. "I'm taking you to the hospital." No answer. The retching had ceased and the bathroom was totally silent. I paced around the corridor, picking at the skin on my thumb, wondering if she'd lost consciousness. "Emily." The bathroom lock clicked and a wide-eyed Emily emerged, the corners of her lips still crusty with puke. She looked even more sickly than before, and only now I noticed how limply her clothes hung from her frail frame. But despite her obvious ailment, she was smiling. "Josh," she whispered, gliding towards me as though she was a ghost. "I have something to tell you." A chill crawled up my spine. Seeing my wife so sick and yet so buoyant was a sight nothing short of unnatural. 2 pink spots appeared on her hollow cheeks as the last of the blood in her body flooded her face. "Honey," she took my hands in hers, her eyes twinkling. I'm pregnant." I stared at her, alarms blaring in my mind. "Isn't that great?" "But," I started, my skin prickling. We haven't had sex in months." She beamed as though this was a part of the good news. "I know." "Then how?" I stammered, mentally accounting for all the times I'd left Emily on her own. Are you cheating on me? The words came out of my mouth before I could stop them. But how could my wife be pregnant if we hadn't had sex? Her face turned pale again. Of course I'm not cheating on you. She looked legitimately hurt. Honey, it's a miracle. What miracle, Emily? I don't understand. How can you be pregnant? She wiped the tears welling up in her eyes. I prayed every single day for God to give us a child. Now he has. I chewed the inside of my lip, wondering if my wife had finally lost it. I knew God would help us. She squealed. I never doubted it for a second. We're having a baby, Josh. Why aren't you happy? Well, perhaps it's because, wait, so you're telling me this baby was immaculately conceived? Yes, she cried, almost leaping up and down with joy. Can you believe it? I most certainly couldn't, but Emily was looking at me as though she had just witnessed the second coming. Well, show me the pregnancy test, I said, peeking over her shoulder into the bathroom. You did take one, didn't you? Her face fell. No, I didn't need to. I stared at her, completely at a loss for what to say. I know because God gave me a sign. What sign would that be? She grinned from ear to ear as though this was exactly the question she was waiting for me to ask, suddenly pulling up her baggy sweatshirt to reveal her stomach. It was bloated and pot-shaped, curving downwards as if she'd swallowed a deflated ball. Sweat sprang out on the back of my neck as I stared at it in horror. My wife, on the other hand, looked delighted. What do you think, Josh? She chirped, as though she was merely asking my opinion on a new pair of shoes. Isn't it amazing? It's, I choked. Honey, can we go to the doctor? Her smile disappeared. A doctor? Josh, we have God helping us now. What kind of doctor could possibly be better than TH? She clutched her stomach suddenly, her gag reflex kicking in. Emily, I gasped, alarmed. What's going on? She heaved, a hand over her mouth, a glob of saliva hanging from her bottom lip. I reached out to help her, but she shook her head weakly. No, just leave it. I'll be fine. Fine. I stared in bewilderment at her belly, still exposed beneath her top. It seemed to be moving. It's kicking, she cried, clutching it with her free hand. Look, honey, our baby is kicking. It was kicking, all right. Her belly was morphing with slow, rhythmic waves. What is that? I whispered, taking a few steps back. But she retched before she could answer, a stream of bile spilling out of her mouth and onto the carpet. Something was squirming in the light brown liquid. It was gray and about 1 foot long. It writhed around the puddle as if it was gasping for air, like a fish on the shore. That's a, I gulped, grabbing onto the doorframe to steady myself. And then they were spilling out of her nostrils like long, rubbery globs of snot. Slimy, white worms were hitting the ground with rain-like thumps and slithering across the floorboards. Emily, I yelled, gripping her by the shoulders and bending her forwards in a feeble attempt to help. Worms were crowning in her throat now too, blocking her airways and sending her crumpling to the ground. With shaking hands, I mashed the buttons for 911. My wife's eyes were glassy and bloodshot as she lay on the carpet surrounded by hundreds of bile-drenched slugs. The doctors couldn't save her. She was pronounced dead before we even reached the hospital. Your wife had a severe case of roundworms. The doctor shook his head, obviously jarred. The condition is not usually lethal, and we've never seen anything like it. Why didn't she come for a checkup before it got to this stage? There was nothing I could possibly say to make sense of the situation. She thought she was pregnant, I whispered, staring down at my hands. Pregnant? The doctor sounded bewildered. Certainly some pregnancy. I knew all too well how it must have sounded. I blamed myself for Emily's death. If I'd been there, if I'd spent more time with her, perhaps this could have been avoided. But she was gone and nothing was going to bring her back. Well, except maybe a miracle. I immediately regretted the thought, because you see, that's when I first felt the gnawing in the pits of my stomach. I think God has blessed me too. I work at the night library. We operate under an eccentric set of rules. It makes sense when you think about it. The quiet kids, the queer kids, the nerds and the geeks and the loners. When everyone else is out at bars and clubs until 2 in the morning, sloppy drunk and shoving their tongues against each other's uvulas in front of God and his brother. Where are they supposed to go? All the calm, hushed corners of the world are inaccessible after around 8 o'clock. No cafes to tuck into to sip on something sweet while clacking away at a keyboard. No bookstores with their worn, welcoming armchairs looking to beckon in the weary. No libraries, except Matt's. Matt Nelson, my boss, is the director of the night library, for lack of a better term. Does he possess the credentials to occupy the position of a library director? Let's just say if tearing through a pack of cigarettes and a pot of coffee in an hour were the top qualifiers, there'd be no better man for the job. But the night library doesn't have a board of trustees to answer to, which means Matt's jed may as well be a master's. It isn't a public establishment. Nobody's paying for its existence with their tax dollars, and the books don't come straight off the press from the publishing house. Ink still wet, pages still hot. I like to think of it as the half-price books of the library world. Our collection is made up of any and everything anyone is willing to contribute, which leaves us with a total sitting somewhere around a cool 1,000 items. It's a good thing, too, because we wouldn't have enough of a staff to manage it all otherwise. In all, there are 7 of us. Alice is our cataloger and Matt's very first employee. When he set out to open the night library's doors, he knew he would need a way to keep track of his inventory, and he only trusted himself to do so with the number of books he could count on both hands. The way he tells it, Alice laughed in his face when he propositioned her. She was working the streets at the time, and when he pulled up to her corner in his '97 Ford Ranger, cranking the window down at a geriatric snail's pace to ask if she was interested in alternative employment, she told him whatever he was paying in a week couldn't hold a candle to what she made in an evening. He handed her his card, which was actually the business card for a local nail salon covered in whiteout and scribbled over with a Sharpie marker, and told her to give him a call if she changed her mind. To this day, she won't tell him why, but when his phone rang smack in the middle of the night less than a week later, it was Alice on the other end. What in God's green hell would anybody want with a library open dusk to dawn? She asked him, once he'd elaborated on the position he was offering. Just let me know, he told her. She was outside the door 20 minutes later. After Alice came Della. She wandered inside one night in the dead of winter, fingertips purple and eyelashes weighted down with ice. Matt was mopping melted snow out of the entryway and she stopped in front of him, blocking his path. "Can I help you?" he asked. No response. He took a moment to size her up, gauging the situation, and tried again. "Are you looking for work?" She snatched the mop straight out of his hand. She's never spoken a word to any of us, but not a speck of dust falls on a single surface before she catches it midair. We aren't sure if Della is even really her name. Matt just caught her writing it on the bathroom wall with foam cleaner one night. And when he asked, there was no objection. Horace was next. He'd been a regular patron of the library for quite some time before Matt took notice of the way he meticulously studied the shelf, halting anytime he spotted a misplaced item to correct it before moving on. Matt stopped him as he was straightening a row of outdated medical texts and said if he was going to volunteer his time, he might as well get paid. Jenny followed not too long after, and she was certainly the most forthright of the crew. She marched directly up to the desk just before closing time and said to Matt, "Don't you have a life outside of this place?" Matt says now that he supposes he should have taken offense, but seeing as how he did not, in fact, have a life outside of the library, he didn't. No, he told her plainly. Why? Because apparently Jenny popped her gum here, which invited Matt to consider banning gum from the premises entirely. Then, he thought, given that he'd never banned anything from the premises, gum seemed like the wrong place to start. "You're here, like, every night. Don't you want some time off? I could run the desk for you. It doesn't look very hard." "Okay," Matt said. He gave her a crash course of the circulation system, tossed her the keys, and headed home. Wiley would be the token charity case, except that they bust their ass harder than the rest of us put together for this place. The first couple of times they came around, they covered one of their eyes with their bangs and hung out in the library's dismal excuse for a teen area from sundown to sunup, never lingering quite long enough to be told they had to leave before Matt locked up, but certainly cutting it close. While Matt was standing on a ladder one night trying to stuff enough paper towels around a faulty sprinkler head to keep it from saturating a ceiling tile, Wiley nearly scared him to his death coming up behind him without a sound. "I want to make a deal with you," they said. Once Matt had recovered from his miniature heart attack and regained his balance, he peered down the ladder to find Wiley staring up at him, face fully bare to him for the first time, right eye bloodshot and swollen with a bruise so dark it resembled a pit just beginning to yellow around the edges. "All right," he agreed, not bothering to ask what the deal might entail. As it turned out, Wiley's bargain was this: anonymity in exchange for labor. "No one can know where I am," Wiley explained. "I can't give you my legal name, or an ID, or my social, but I'll work hard and I'll do it for free if I can stay here. I won't run up the water or the electric. I won't turn any lights on or even use the bathroom during the day. It'll be like the building is empty the whole time it's closed. I swear, I just need somewhere to lock myself in. Matt's only conditions were that Wiley accept a paycheck and B, keep their arrangement quiet, as he didn't need everyone in a rough spot to come to him expecting that they could strike the same deal. Wiley said, I have no one to tell, and then asked where Matt kept his tools. If we've ever had a leak since, it hasn't lasted long enough for Matt to call a repairman before Wiley's had it fixed. As for me, it was sort of a fluke that I was hired at all. I don't sleep much during the night. In fact, I've only ever had one day shift job, and my body's internal alarm clock wasn't a fan of that arrangement. I was working overnights at a nursing home before the library, and I happened to pass by on a night off after a walk. Too antsy to sit alone in my apartment. I'd never noticed it before, which isn't unusual for me as I pride myself in my attention span's ability to give goldfish a run for their money. But the dim glow emanating from inside among the sea of darkened storefronts stood out like a beacon. My first impression based on the interior of the building was that it had likely been a laundromat in a past life, with its paltry concrete floors and low, tiled ceilings. The short, sparse shelves lined along the entryway led me in a natural progression to the circulation desk, where Matt had his face buried in his hands and Jenny was holding open a book next to him that had cracked fully down the spine, loose pages lying haphazardly across the countertop. Can't afford to replace shit all the time, Matt was saying, muffled by his palms. Whatever, if it's too bad to glue it, just, I don't know, throw it away, I guess. I'm not sure what possessed me to do so, but I took a step forward, fingering the edge of the front cover. I can fix it, I said. And then, as though such a vague explanation would make the situation less awkward somehow, I do that. Fix books. Matt's head raised slowly, as though someone had attached it to a string. Got a whole tower in the back. Can you fix all of them? I mean, I'd have to look at them first, I told him. I've never done it on, like, a professional level, but my grandpa had some book presses he left me when I was in high school, so I've been doing it as a hobby for 10 years, give or take. Matt seemed to mull this over for a moment. Most of what we've got's not anything special, but there are a couple of collector's items here and there. Signed copies, first editions, stuff like that. Can't find them damn near anywhere, and if you do, people want a pretty penny for them. What's your name? Adam. Matt stuck his hand across the desk. Welcome aboard, Adam. When can you start? That was about 3 years ago, which doesn't sound like a ton of time. Granted, but there are some things around here you have to get used to so quick that by 3 months in you start to feel like a seasoned vet. Every place has its odd little ins and outs, of course. We've got plenty. The back door next to the dumpster sticks from the outside, so we have to prop it open to take the trash out unless we want to walk around to the front. One of the bathroom lights is finicky. When the switch is flipped, they all shut off but the very center panel, and it takes a few tries to make it cooperate. Our power gets knocked out so easily in storms that we've got about a metric fuckton of battery-operated fans to keep cool, and a whole manual checkout system for when the computers are down. But as inconvenient as these little quirks can be at times, they're things we're all more than happy to deal with day to day. Matt's a good boss. He takes care of us with what little means he has. We don't get benefits, but he pays us for a full week of sick days each fiscal year, and we get paid holidays off. If we have something going on that we need to miss for, he never says no. We essentially set our own schedules, and there's no minimum to the number of hours we can work so long as we're cool with the cut on our checks. The break room stays stocked with generic snacks and off-brand sodas, and as long as we're not tending to a patron, he genuinely couldn't care less whether we're on our phones or listening to music as long as our work is done. We don't have a dress code, no staff meetings, no 8-hour trainings. I won't be a millionaire anytime soon, but the pay is good, better than I expected. When Matt told me at the beginning of my interview what the pay rate was, I couldn't help raising a brow. I don't have a degree, I informed him, in case somehow he'd confused me with someone whose life was far more put together, or any experience in the field. Technically, I know, he said. Just think of it as incentive. I hope it's enough to keep you around. I didn't understand at first what the hell that was supposed to mean. We're in a slightly rougher area of town, so I figured maybe we'd run into the occasional dispute or keyed up addict. Then I finished my entry packet and flipped it over to find the last paper on the table, simply titled Staff Rules. It read as follows. 1. If you come across a man named Doug, tell him that of course you recognize him. Furthermore, ask why he's introducing himself, as you've worked together since you were hired. He will laugh and ask your forgiveness for being so forgetful, at which point you should be clear to go about your day. However, if he happens to ask if you think he's doing all right at his job, be sure to tell him he's doing so well that if he ever left, we could never hire someone else to take his place. 2. There is no pool in the library, not in the basement, nor on the roof. If someone asks if you've been swimming in the pool yet, do not give a definitive answer. Simply say that you don't like to swim. Important. Do not say you can't swim, just that you don't enjoy it. If you see a pool, exit the building and do not return until sunset the next evening. You're simply exhausted from working night shift. 3. Do not bring peanuts or any peanut products into the building. Horace, our page, is allergic. 4. The second floor is only storage. Nothing is moving upstairs. If you think you hear anything unusual, it's either the HVAC system or the pipes. 5. All of the keys that you need can be found on the keyring in the drawer below the time clock. If you come across a door that isn't labeled on the cheat sheet for the keys, you don't need to open it. It's likely just maintenance access. 6. Staff parking is in the upper lot. 7. When working in the children's area, do not be alarmed if books fall off the shelves from time to time. It's nearly imperceptible to the naked eye, but several of the shelves are built at a slight angle. 8. The coffee pot in the staff kitchen is free for everyone to use, and coffee supplies are located in the cabinet above the microwave. If you pick up the coffee pot and find that it is full of a dark, viscous substance, simply clean it out in the sink before using it. Just plug your nose while doing so. 9. We do not have gender-specific restrooms, and any protest in regards to such will not be tolerated. 10. If you see an elderly Hispanic woman dressed in mourning garb crying quietly with her head down at the table in the back corner next to nonfiction, do not approach her. However, if she makes eye contact with you of her own accord, be sure to offer her your condolences. If she signals for you to come closer, tell her that you're sorry, but you have to get back to work. If she starts to stand, turn calmly away and begin walking at a brisk but unalarmed pace back toward the front of the building. Do not look behind you. Do not run. 11. On the last Saturday of each month, our custodian Della uses a specific cleaning solution to mop. The red coloration comes from the active ingredient, which is what protects the floors and keeps them from staining in the event of spills. It is not blood. 12. Please do not use Windex on the plexiglass windows of the meeting room. It streaks. 13. Keep an analog watch on your person at all times. If you ever feel that too little or too much time has passed since you entered the building, consult it rather than your phone or the clock on the computer. Whatever it says is correct. We look forward to working with you. Welcome to the Night Library. I've had several experiences worth recounting, to say the least, but the first story that comes to mind is in regards to Rule 2, so I thought I'd share that with you today. I'd been working at the Night Library for exactly 7 days and everything was going surprisingly smoothly. As any sane person would do, I had put the list of rules out of my mind, gathering that they were nothing more than a tactic to haze new employees, assuming that I would have a leg up on them if I didn't acknowledge the list at all. I hadn't even mentioned it when I'd finished filling out my entry paperwork, simply slipped it into my locker and handed the rest into Matt. Oh, I was asked about it, of course, several times over the course of the following nights. Various coworkers approached me to inquire as to whether anything had happened to me yet. When I asked what they meant, their response was always some variation of, "You know the rules," and I would just snort and roll my eyes and be on my way. On the evening of my 4th shift, I had stepped away from the little hole in the back office that Matt had set up as a book mending station for me and was briefly helping Jenny out. We were unusually swamped at the desk and Matt had taken off for the night, so I figured she could use a little extra manpower. We'd worked our way almost entirely through the line, and when the face of the last patron finally surfaced from the crowd, Jenny was still busy with someone else, so naturally it was me they looked to. "Hi," I said. "What can we do for you?" That was when I noticed their eyes. There wasn't anything wrong with them. Not technically. They were dark, but not unnaturally so. Not bloodshot. The pupils weren't abnormally large, but there was something behind them that No, let me try that again. There was nothing behind them. That was the problem. I looked away. "Pool," they said. I cleared my throat. "Sorry, pool. Your pool. I need help finding it." I laughed, and a cool air of relief washed over me. They looked soulless and creepy as hell on purpose, of course. Matt had put them up to this, or if not Matt, one of the other employees. "Sorry, buddy," I told them. "That's not gonna work on me. Nice job, though. You kind of freaked me out for a second." The patron said nothing, just ever so slightly furrowed their brow and tilted their head to the side, as though they didn't understand what I was saying. "I need help finding your pool," they repeated. I leaned partway across the counter, lowering my voice so that Jenny wouldn't overhear. She seemed preoccupied enough, but you never quite know with her. "Look, dude, I don't want to spoil the fun for everyone else, so I'm gonna let them think they're pulling one over on me for a while. Okay, but I'm not buying it. I'll walk away from the desk with you, but once we're out of the line of sight you can drop the act." This seemed to satisfy them well enough, because they turned and began heading opposite my direction. I quickly ducked out from behind the counter to follow. We walked in silence until we were safely hidden in the stacks, and then I stopped, reaching out to place a hand on their shoulder. "All right, pal, I think we've made it far enough." They faced me, and I waited for the facade to fall away. It didn't. "Your pool," they recited once more. Slowly, a quiet unease began to creep up my spine. I managed. "Where is it?" For a moment, I considered. There was absolutely no way in hell any of this rules bullshit was real. But why were they so dedicated? "Is Matt paying you to do this?" They stared blankly back at me, the same dead eyes as before, unblinking and cold. "Where?" they demanded icily, "is your profile?" As little stock as I had put into the list, it had, in its absurdity, stuck with me in such a way that made it difficult not to recall near to every detail. "There is no pool in the library," I remembered reading, and then, "not in the basement. It's in the basement." I tried, fearing that the next query would be where the basement was located, but no more questions came. Instead, the patron nodded and left me alone between Stephen King and Lion Moriarty. I shouldn't have followed them. For countless reasons, I shouldn't have. But I needed to know what was going on. So I peeked around the edge of the shelf, ensuring that I'd given them enough leeway not to take notice of me trailing them. And then I set off. They were headed toward the children's area, which was entirely across the building from where we'd just been, and I was forced to keep my pace brisk so as not to lose sight of them. They bobbed and weaved in and out of my view, but I always managed to catch up just before it was too late. We traversed through the baskets of puzzles and blocks, along the dingy train mat thrown thoughtlessly across the largest expanse of open floor, and somewhere to my right, a read-along book that had been left open was stuck on a loop of animal sounds. We passed by the library's small collection of second-hand leapfrog learning pads and stepped over a spilled bin of well-worn stuffed animals, me keeping as quiet as I could all the while. Finally, we reached the rear wall, and I saw something I'd never noticed before. There was a door. Nothing about it was special or notable in the slightest. It was a metal rectangle that had been painted the same deep, flat shade of blue as the building's exterior doors, and it was fitted with an identical window so high up I would have needed a ladder to see what lay beyond. As was the only logical next event in our sequence, the patron approached it and turned the handle, which opened to them fluidly and without issue. Half of me hoped it would do the same when it was my turn. Half hoped it wouldn't. The door wasn't loud. I wasn't particularly concerned that they'd hear me breach it once it had fallen closed behind them. But just to be safe, I counted off 10 Mississippis before easing it open and slipping inside. Immediately, I was immersed in darkness. It would have been total had it not been for the dim glow permeating through from the bottom of the set of descending steps before me. My brain, scrambling to compute, insisted that the lack of a basement in the building must have been part of the elaborate ploy. The fact that I'd never noticed the door didn't mean it didn't exist. Clearly it did, as I'd just used it. I'd only been here a week. It wasn't like I'd had a chance to explore every cubic inch of the place. Taking a steadying breath, I mentally chastised myself for being so gullible and started down the stairs. It took longer than I felt it should to reach the end. Far longer, but I chalked it up to anticipation and kept on until I reached a level, concrete platform. The only turn to make was a right one, so I took it, drawing steadily closer to the disembodied light source. I traveled down a narrow corridor, minding my step once I realized that the floor was covered in about 1/8 of an inch of water, just enough to result in a soft, echoing splash if I swung my foot down with enough force. I didn't hear anything ahead of me, but the patron hadn't preceded me by much. They had to be fairly close. Soon, the hallway opened into what I understood to be the basement. Beams and pipes littered the ceiling in an impossible maze, and I found that the light I'd been following was produced by a single, low-wattage bulb suspended from the rafters by a wire. I could see the center of the room clearly, but the edges blurred back into shadow. Straight ahead, I thought something shifted, but I couldn't be sure, considering that I was out in the open now with nowhere to hide. I called out a reluctant, "Hello." No direct response came, but there was a quiet skittering from the same area where I thought I'd seen motion, so I moved toward it against my better judgment, squinting in attempt to make out a shape of any form. When I finally settled on one, it was the yawning, black mouth of an entryway. Almost blindly, I felt my way forward and stuck my hand inside to be met with empty air. The basement was cooler than upstairs already, but as I stepped fully through, I estimated the temperature dropped to be another 5 degrees at the very least. The water that had veiled the floor from the bottom of the stairs had never receded, but it grew a hair deeper here. Just enough so that it began lapping at the canvas above the soles of my shoes. "Hello?" I asked again, too unsure of my surroundings to go any further. I stood my ground and listened intently. This time, I could swear I heard a faint splash. It's difficult to explain what happened next. It was as though a film of a sort lifted from the entirety of the premises, and with it, the darkness. Not like someone had flipped on a switch, more like opening a blackout curtain. That's when I realized that it was because something was emerging from underwater. Before I go into detail about that, let me set the scene for you. As soon as my environment was illuminated, my heart gained sentience and decided there was no time like the present to explore the outside of my chest. I was the origin of freeze being tacked onto the old fight or flight adage, but once I'd thawed, I took a liberal, stumbling step backward, so close to the space my toes had just inhabited that I'd have been done for had I allowed myself so much as a readjustment. There was a pool, or rather, a pit full of water, so dark and deep it appeared bottomless. Something about it affected my perception of the rest of the space. It was so all-encompassing that everything around it seemed to be pulling toward it as though it was the center of gravity, dizzying and cloying, thankfully. However, my focus was instantaneously directed elsewhere. Have you seen an anglerfish? I assume you have, but if not, take a second to Google it. What had arisen from the depths of the pool, pond, liquid grave greatly resembled one in several respects, the most notable being the giant, pulsating bulb protruding from the center of its head and dangling in such a way as to perfectly illuminate the second most notable feature, the teeth. The most prominent difference between the thing before me and a traditional anglerfish was the size. For example, a fully grown anglerfish generally reaches the length of a ruler, but has on rare occasion been known to scarcely outgrow a yardstick. A yardstick may have been a match for a single, dagger-like protrusion jutting like a stalagmite from this creature's jaw. I ran, slipping along the damp floor and barely catching myself on the wall several times before finally finding myself in the stairwell again. I began ascending it with all the force and swiftness in my being. They say the drive home always feels shorter, and this was apparently applicable to the trip up the stairs from the gate to hell versus down the stairs to it as well, because it felt as though not a second had passed before I was shoving the door open and collapsing onto the carpeted ground outside to catch my breath. When I got my bearings and stood, glancing quickly over my shoulder to be sure I hadn't inadvertently invited anything to accompany me out of the basement, I felt my stomach plummet. The door was gone. I looked insane by the time I made it back to the desk, and Jenny wasn't shy about telling me so. "What happened to you?" she asked. "Did somebody waterboard you or is that sweat?" "I saw it," I told her. "The pool." She cocked one brow, eyes minutely widening. "Welcome to the club, noob. Get out of here. I'll see you tomorrow." I got out. Needless to say, I started studying that list like gospel the next night and never questioned it again. It's saved my ass a fair few times now, as it has everyone's here. And before you ask why I don't quit, why any of us doesn't, I have to admit that I don't have a solid answer for you. The money is definitely part of it. Matt knows what he's doing, buttering us up, giving us incentive not to seek out alternative employment. He keeps the staff small and cuts corners pretty much anywhere else he can so he's able to pay us what he does. But there's something else, too, something too intangible to verbalize, and it's unspoken between the lot of us that the sensation is mutual. We're just supposed to be here. Besides, I don't know if the library would take too kindly to us leaving. The Mormons who came to our door were Mormons. They came on a Saturday afternoon so hot that all we could do was watch the flowers wilt and thank God for central air. The older one rang the doorbell and smiled in his immaculate short-sleeved white shirt and cheap black tie, a uniform of momentary inconvenience, probably for both of us. "Who is it, honey?" My wife, Kate, occupied with the baby while our 6-year-old, Camille, hummed and colored in the living room. "Mormons," I answered. "Be nice, Jack." "Yeah, will do." I opened the door and right away the heat pummeled, licking sweat onto my face the way an excitable St. Bernard might. I say I opened the door, but Elder Todd was really the one who answered it. Hi, and a very pleasant afternoon to you. Gosh, what a wonderful neighborhood you live in. Truly a blessing to have so much grass. He chuckled. Anyway, I'm Elder Todd and I have a story of God to share. Have you heard of the Church of Latter Saints, sir? Deep breath, big pageant smile, blue eyes sparkling beneath a drooping lock of wet blonde hair. This guy was somebody's poster boy for dedicated evangelism, a gold star sticker masquerading as a door-to-door God salesman. His partner was decidedly less chipper. He lay on our porch in the fetal position, so sweaty I could see his armpit hair through his shirt. Fuck, is he okay? He doesn't look okay. Elder Todd's 10,000-watt smile fizzled into concern. He's had a long day, we both have, but the sun is shining and the sky is blue. Right, his smile returned, though stripped of some of the showmanship it had started with. Truly a wonderful neighborhood. Jesus fucking Christ. Maybe I could get him a glass of water, or call someone. Did you two drive? You must have, right. I found myself mentally grasping at garbled tenets of a half-dozen backwaters of Christian faith. Mormons drove, didn't they? It was the Amish who had the horses and buggies. Or was it Mennonites? Wait, what was the difference? Fuck, not relevant. Mormons drove. I was at least 70% certain of that. Todd looked down at his sweaty companion, competing with my uncertainty, lines cutting across his forehead. Then his eyes rejoined mine and left just as quickly, sliding past me and over my shoulder. Oh, hi. I hope my husband Jack has been. Kate slipped into the doorway beside me, our son Harrison cradled in her arms. She gasped at the sight of the other Mormon. Todd kept smiling dutifully. Camille kept humming obliviously. Jesus, is he okay? What happened? Do you two boys want to come inside for a minute? It's sweltering out there. Todd shifted on his feet and nervously twisted a dangling strap on his backpack. I wondered, unhelpfully, if the Mormon church was perhaps in the backpack manufacturing business, or if they just bought everything in bulk. Kate brought me back to the moment with a prodding elbow. Oh, right, yeah, of course. You two should come in, just until he, gets back on his feet. The sparkle in Todd's eyes returned. Oh, as long as it's not an imposition, sir, ma'am. I sighed. No, not at all. I'll help you get him inside. Todd's companion was Elder Marshall. He was 18. Bound for Brigham Young University in the fall, and he had a lovely tenor when he saw fit to sing. All things I learned secondhand. Todd liked to chatter away, apparently. Marshall was barely conscious, but a minute later he was at least lively enough to sip at a glass of water. Camille eyed him curiously, abandoning her coloring for the intrigue of our impromptu clinic. Daddy, is he sick? Honey, he's blessed, Todd interrupted, to have found good Samaritans like your mommy and daddy. He beamed at Camille as Kate rocked Harrison in an armchair. Camille smiled back shyly. Say, Jack, could I trouble you for a glass of milk if you've got it? Todd asked abruptly. Milk? Fucking hell. Todd was truly a parody of wholesomeness. Sure, Todd. Our kitchen's in the basement. Old house. I'll be right back. And mind your manners, Camille. Camille balked defensively and I went down for a glass of milk. While I was getting it, I heard the shuffling of feet upstairs, Camille showing off for our guest. No doubt, skipping rope or doing cartwheels. Kate's voice rose in an indistinct chiding squawk following a thump. Camille didn't cry though, so I shook my head and chuckled to myself. What Elder Todd must think. He was probably smiling, complimenting us on our wonderful carpet or something, as long as he wasn't giving a sermon on the virtues of polygamy or HRMMM. I hurried back upstairs. Hey Todd, I got your... I stopped. Our front door was wide open and Todd sat where he had been on the sofa, smiling. Hair collected out of his face yet still dark with sweat, but Kate and the kids had left. So had Marshall. Oh, thank you, Jack. I know it's a bother, but I go to milk in times of stress. There really is no better refreshment on God's green earth. Incorrect, but in a way entirely expected. Still, I narrowed my eyes at the absurdity of the statement. Hey, did my wife and daughter go outside? Todd sipped then glubbed the glass down before answering. Yep, they went to show Elder Marshall the garden. He's feeling much better. You really do have a beautiful family. Todd spread out his arms and sunk back into the sofa, smiling contentedly as he shut his eyes. Great, thanks, I said, discomforted by Todd's comfort. Well, you've probably got a lot of houses to get to, and it's almost Harrison's nap time. So, I had made my way to the door, standing hopefully like some border collie at the paddock. Todd kept his eyes shut and began merrily tapping his fingers on the sofa back. I cleared my throat. No acknowledgement. Rap-a-tap-tap. Was he waiting for Kate and the kids? Did he really think that after we nursed his friend back to health, that we were also gonna sit through his timeshare presentation on Yankee Doodle Jesus? Maybe Kate was nice enough for something like that, but I sure as hell wasn't. Hey Todd, I'm glad your friend is feeling better, but it's about time to. I halted my bum rush. I had heard a sound. Footsteps. Upstairs. Katie, are you still in the house? Todd, I thought you said that. Yeah, Jack, just doing nap time, she answered thinly. Every thing's fine. Everything didn't sound fine. Todd, wake the fuck up. Kate, are you okay? I started for the stairs and saw Kate making her descent, slowly, unsteadily. Kate, what's wrong? Where are the kids? Where's Marsh? Jack, stop. The kids they're Mormons now. And me too, Elder Todd. Kate was pale, shaking, but smiling uneasily back at Todd, who was now watching her with one open eye as the rest of him remained serene and unchanged. Glad to hear it, Sister Paulson, he said. Tap-a-ta-tap. Oh, fuck this. I moved toward Kate, and when I was close enough, I whispered, what the fuck is going on? Jack, I'm not supposed to say. She looked like she was about to cry, and then a squeak on the stairs above struck the distress from her face and replaced it with something worse. It was a look I'd only seen once before, on a day when we had taken Camille to the emergency room. Kate grabbed my arm, squeezed. Just keep smiling, Jack. You just need to smile. She was gritting her teeth. It was in that moment that I noticed the blood clinging to her dark hair and the torn earlobe that had put it there. She was missing an earring, but she was still smiling. The vague strain of everything made me feel queasy, the urgent fear in Kate's eyes. I'm not supposed to say what? Jack, fucking smile, please. I grimaced. The stairs resumed their squeaking. Kate shuddered. Then I looked upwards and saw a man walking down the stairs, not Elder Marshall, a stranger wearing a drab black suit that wouldn't have looked out of place on the Titanic, and a sharp smile that falsely offered kindness. Who the fuck are you? Jack, smile. I couldn't bring myself to heed Kate's warning, not as the man plodded toward me, standing between me and my children. I stood firm, trying to muster strength in spite of the confusion, but I wasn't ready. The man's hand was quick, a little magician's flourish, and I didn't immediately feel the pain in my face, but I saw the blood on his straight razor as he folded the blade. His smile never faltered. I staggered backwards, losing my footing on a stair and knocking my head against the newel post as I fell. Kate shrieked, and the man grabbed her by the hair and dragged her into the living room. She'd stopped smiling for just a moment. Now she was weeping and I was dazed. I tried to stand, but my head weighed my body down. Another squeak on the stairs. My vision blurred as I tried to resolve a new figure above me, a black-haired boy wearing long white shorts, and nothing else, smiling unnaturally wide. He stood for a moment, watching me, giggling softly. Kate was screaming, her voice receding away. The boy began to mince giddily on the landing above me, shaking his fists excitedly beneath his chin. Then suddenly he tore down the stairs toward me. I raised my arms over my face. I couldn't think of anything else to do but shout, "Stop!" The boy jumped when he was 3 stairs from the bottom, vaulted over my legs, and landed squarely on my chest. I heard a crack and heaved out a bloody breath. The boy bounded off me, nearly fell, but caught himself and skittered away. Fuck, who are these people? Wheeze, how many of them were in my house? Wheeze, what did they want? I watched helplessly, crumpled and bleeding, as the boy scuttled beneath our sofa. He peered out from the darkness below it, and I shivered seeing those quiet, watchful eyes. Todd kept up his easy smile, kept tapping, as though all the terror around him was somehow distant, unimportant. Kate's screams mingled with chugging sobs, somewhere unseen. I tried to move and my body screamed with her, harmonizing my pain with something horrible. I couldn't help her. I couldn't help my children. My cell phone lay on a side table next to Todd. No help, so I wept and wheezed, and the sting of the slash on my face began to grow. Why was this happening to us? I closed my eyes and tried to ignore Kate's screams and the utter silence of my children upstairs. It felt like resignation, like a betrayal of the people I love. The sting of that burrowed into my mind more palpably than the trickle of blood on my cheek. Life is easier when you smile, Jack. Todd's voice above me. I didn't want to see his face. The prophet will put a smile back on Kate's face. Elder Smith is very good with those of wavering faith. The prophet, Elder Smith. He couldn't be serious. You're not, wheeze, Mormons. My voice came out as a whisper. He'll help your faith too, Jack. Do not fault and envy over the blessings your family receives while you are sleeping. Simply wake and see God in the light. Kate was no longer screaming, just sobbing quietly, and I felt fingers on my eyelids. Simply wake, Jack. He pulled open my eyes with his fingers. Look, I saw a blur of Kate stumbling in, led by the man in black, Elder Smith, with his straight posture and top hat. He towered over Kate's slumped form. "You must have questions," Todd whispered in my ear. "I know I would, but you will soon know so much. Your kindness was prophesied, and your family will be the vessel for God's wisdom. Your lovely, beautiful family." Todd stroked my left eyeball with his finger and moaned quietly. I blinked just as Kate's torn dress was becoming clear. Her hollow stare didn't meet my eyes, but her mouth was trying to smile. "All right, Jack, on with the miracles." Todd grabbed my arms and dragged me across the floor. I gasped at the jolt of pain and my throat gurgled. When I got to Kate, she was whispering something. "We're not going to hurt you. We're not going to hurt you. We're not going to hurt you. Just smile pretty. We're not going to hurt you." She shied away as I reached for her and my hateful gaze landed on Elder Smith. He in turn gaped gleefully back at me, the apples of his cheeks firming into grotesque joy. And then he took off his top hat and set it gently on the ground. "Go on, Sister Paulson," Todd cooed. "Look into the hat and tell us the revelation of God." Kate was despondent, repeating her comforting lie again and again. But she shrieked as Elder Smith's hand found the back of her neck. She struggled as he forced her head down toward the hat's yawning opening. Strangely, I swore I could see light on her face before it disappeared, an oddity drowned in waves of dread and helpless fear. A moment later, she was sobbing again, thrashing as her pinned head deformed the hat. "Tell us what you see, Sister Paulson," Todd shouted. I heard a shuffle as his voice rose. I looked and saw the boy emerging from underneath the sofa. He grabbed my leg, giggled, and bit into my calf. I yelped, kicked him away, and he wailed as he slid back into the darkness. Who the fuck were these people? Where were my children? Why? I grabbed at my calf and was punished for the movement with a fierce stab in my rib cage. I could barely breathe, punctured lung I guessed, but the adrenaline kept me woefully lucid. Too lucid for the look of pallid terror on Kate's face as she lifted her head. This time her gaze did meet mine and I shrunk away. "Hey, Kate, they said they wouldn't hurt them. I would have fought, Jack. They said they wouldn't." I looked up toward the ceiling, to the beams and boards and vestigial knob and tube wiring that we had once found charming in a rustic sort of way. A stain now spread along the wood, and by some grim coincidence, that moment was the one where the first drop of blood stretched and fell from the ceiling, just below the bedroom our children shared. "Your turn, Jack," Todd pipped. Kate cowered and shook. I tried to fight as Elder Smith and Elder Todd dragged me to the hat, but I looked and saw a phone inside of it, the familiar interface of a FaceTime call, a bedroom, blood, the smiling face of Elder Marshall, and an unmoving heap I didn't want to be familiar. The children had been so quiet. Even Harrison hadn't made a sound. Elder Smith's hand slipped into the hat, swiped away the video, and left a Google Doc in its place. "Read the words of prophecy," he said softly. "Write the words of the herald angel and be blessed." Elder Todd set a laptop in front of me. He had it open to Reddit, and I began to type this story. "So spake the angel to the new prophet of God, Jack Paulson. So sprung the font of blood, of salvation, from above to rain down and cleanse us of sin. Have ye faith in the stranger that comes to your door in need. He will deliver you. Amen." Edit. They're praying now, watching the blood. Only parts of this story are true, the parts they planned and the parts they forced. The reality is worse. I live in Flagstaff, Arizona. Do not try and help me. Our neighbors did. They heard the screams. Now everything is quiet. They are not Mormons. If they come, do not let them in. There is something terrible hiding in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Frank, you good? I hadn't appreciated how different it would be under the water's surface. With so much trash overhead, the sun was barely visible, and my eyes struggled to adjust after the blinding light of the Pacific sun. It was nearly pitch black, and the water was cloudy from all the sediment and microplastics. It reduced visibility to a few meters, and Adam and Hannah looked like little more than blurry shapes in the dark even though they were no more than a few feet away. I'm okay. It was second nature to keep my mouth shut underwater, and I knew it was going to be some time before I got used to talking in these new diving masks. Adam and Hannah nodded at each other, and both turned their lights on. To my relief, visibility improved enough that if I squinted, I could see who was who based on either a slim or muscular silhouette. Hannah gently glided over and tapped her helmet to remind me to turn my own light on. I fumbled for the switch, and it lit up, revealing her blue eyes smiling at me as she floated a few feet away. I caught a glimpse of her smiling blue eyes and was reminded of why Discovery execs were scouting her as a potential TV presenter. Much better, she laughed as she checked that I was securely attached to the dive line. See, it's not so bad, is it? Is he good? Adam asked her, and she gave the okay sign to let him know I was. Still, Adam looked me up and down and asked directly, Frank, you good buddy? I managed a gentle nod. We need to be careful, Adam said as he floated over and took hold of where my suit clipped onto the dive line. The masks will let us talk to each other and the ship while underwater, but it won't give the sound any sense of distance or direction, so it can be pretty disorientating. Now, listen to me carefully. Do not unclip yourself from the dive line. If you break the surface, there'll be a foot of trash, at least, blocking your view for 360 degrees. You won't be able to see the ship, and you do not want to get lost out here. Only the last few words got through my mental fog. My heart was racing, and even under the wetsuit I could feel shivers crawling across my skin. We floated in a cloud of suffocating plastic snow, lit only by the occasional slither of sun as the sea parted the trash overhead. I could feel a confusing mix of claustrophobia and agoraphobia. We were trapped between the vast open void below and the ceiling of trash overhead. My movement was sluggish, and all around me the hazy abyss flickered with constant motion that I tried to track and make sense of. These were warm waters, I thought. There had to be life all around us, and surely it couldn't all be friendly. Jellyfish, sharks, parasites galore. The sea was filled with all sorts of nasty shit, and it had to be out there somewhere, aware of us, as if it was summoned by my anxious thoughts. Something strange caught my eye, floating far away at the very limits of my vision. A flicker of motion, shifting patterns of light. My brain correlated with her without sufficient evidence. By the time I turned to look fully in its direction, it had already gone. The only sense it left me with was one of great size. Frank, Adam poked me with a finger. Dude, are you okay? I turned to see the two other divers staring at me. I'm good, I said. Let's get this over with. It was with great relief I found my hand touching the side of the ship once more. It had been an hour since we left, and I'd made sure to point and shoot at every little thing Hannah told me to. Now it was over. I couldn't wait to get out of that damned water. My anxiety had caused me to babble on endlessly about random crap, and more than once Hannah had basically told me to shut up. But after a few minutes I'd start up again, yammering on about any old thing just to keep my mind off my fear. It didn't help that I kept seeing something lingering at the very edge of my sight, circling at a distance while refusing to solidify into anything I might recognize. Adam noticed that I was distracted, and he gave my arm a tap to get my attention. Frank, you're last because the equipment is so heavy. That way I can help the others bring you up. Aw shit, really? I groaned. You can take it off, he replied. We'll take you up separately to the equipment. I clutched at my cameras protectively. They were how I made a living, and I wasn't letting them go easily. No, I'll be last, I said. Right, well, don't go wandering off, he said, and both he and Hannah laughed. I chuckled as well, but I grabbed the dive line and checked I was still attached to the ship just in case. By the time I looked back, Adam was already being lifted out of the water by 3 pairs of eager hands. Hannah stayed beside me until Adam gave us the okay, and just as quickly, she reached her arms into the air and left the water. Holy shit, Adam's voice in my ear. I swiveled, expecting him right beside me, but he must have left his helmet on, and I could hear him talking to the others on deck. What the fuck is that? Someone cried in the background, but there was a clamor of voices and gasps that made my blood run cold. Helpless and paranoid that they were talking about something in the water, I turned sluggishly to catch sight of what might be behind me, but there was only a wall of trash 1 foot high. No way, not out this. Here, doesn't belong. I pushed myself closer to the ship and reached up, but no one was there to grab me. I started to slap the hull, desperate to get their attention, but no one was coming. Whatever they'd seen, I'd fallen to the bottom of the priority list. When I screamed into my radio, I was only one of a dozen people shouting for attention. Even worse, I caught a snippet of what Adam was saying. Shark, shark, I cried into my headset. Guys, did you just fucking say shark? I pushed my back to the ship and ducked underwater to see what might be nearby. There was only open water stretching off into a deep dark blue beneath my feet. For a second there I lost myself staring into those abyssal waters until a flicker of movement caught my attention and I scanned the water around me. That was when something strange emerged out of the murky distance. A torpedo-shaped monstrosity far larger than anything else I had expected. Whatever this thing was, it was the size of a school bus with fins as large as my chest. Frank, it's a whale shark, Hannah cried joyfully into my headset. Oh my god, that's incredible, they never come out this far. What the fuck is a whale shark? I whispered, terrified of attracting this leviathan's attention. It's harmless, Hannah replied. Utterly harmless, I promise you, Frank. It won't hurt you. That's incredible. She was giggling. It's a filter feeder, Adam interjected. Curious, but friendly. Frank, it won't hurt you. It might even play with you. Hannah was babbling on in the background. Whether she was right about the gentle giant or not didn't matter to me. The whale shark disappeared into the filthy water and my skin crawled with the knowledge it might still be circling close by. Having had enough, I threw my hands above the surface of the water and screamed, "Get me the fuck out of this water now." Adam and someone else must have registered the sheer panic in my voice because I was suddenly being lifted up. I had my hand on the bottom lip of the deck when Adam's eyes went wide and the crew member beside him shrieked, dropped my arm, and began to scrabble backwards. Panicking, I snatched at Adam with both arms and held on, forcing him to use all his strength just to stop the two of us pitching into the water. Just as I thought we would lose the fight, I suddenly started to rise without effort. A current from below started to buoy me upwards, and I caught a glimpse of a mouth wider than a door lurching up towards me. I became so afraid that my whole body went numb, and for a few brief seconds it felt as if I was watching the whole scene from outside my own body. I noted with detached horror that the shark's rubbery mouth had already reached my waist, but to Adam's credit he kept a grip on me and took advantage of the shark's upward momentum to pull me the rest of the way before that grotesque yawning mouth could snap shut around me. I hit the deck in a state of pure shock and looked down expecting my legs to be torn to shreds. Did it bite me? I stammered. They have no teeth, Hannah explained. They can't. It couldn't possibly have mistaken you for food. It must have been an accident. It's dead. Adam was leaning over the rails and shaking his head. I struggled to process what he said, so I dragged myself up and flopped over to the edge where the monster lay on its side. In daylight I could see it was bloated, broken skin running along its flanks. Colorless fat fell out of open wounds like clumps of sofa stuffing, and the eye facing us was burst and empty. In one or two places I could clearly make out bone. What the fuck? I muttered, as if it was tired of being watched. The whale shark twitched, and its body fell lifelessly below the water. The suction of its descent pulled the floating trash back over like a blanket, and within seconds there was no sign there had even been anything there. Why aren't there any gulls? Alec was the captain of the vessel, and an otherwise taciturn man who rarely spoke to the documentary crew. It was plain as day he particularly disliked the scientists, who filled the lower decks with endless equipment and chatty cliques. But I guess he must have found the filming crew a little easier to speak to since he'd asked me for a light once or twice, and had now sought me out on deck to ask a question. What do you mean? Every time we pass this way the sky is filled with the fucking things, he replied as he scanned the horizon. It's a floating garbage dump, he added. But now, where are the gulls? It's never like this, never quiet. I took a moment to listen to the gentle susurration of whispering plastic caught in the tropical waves. We must be due to leave soon, I asked, and he nodded. Thank fuck for that, I added. A few seconds of silence as he smoked his cigarette. I took a look at the footage you brought up, he said, still not sure what that shark was doing. Hannah says the animal must have been confused, I replied. Blind. Didn't even know I was in the water. Right. I could tell by Alec's vacant gaze he didn't think much of that. Only thing is I stayed up last night going over that footage. Not just the stuff you shot deliberately, but the GoPro footage from the cameras you'd strapped to your back. And that thing had been following you since you got in the water. What do you think that means? I think it means it was hunting you, he replied. I thought back to the endless glimpses of a strange shape passing forever in the distance. Hannah says they're not predators. They aren't, he confirmed. Even if it got you, couldn't have done shit with you. It's a filter feeder, eats plankton. Best it could have done was drown you out of spite. I took a deep breath and appreciated the feeling of being alive and dry on the ship. Alec looked ready to say something when we were both distracted by the sound of flapping wings as a gull descended onto the floating island. I chuckled and began to say, signs of life, when a quiet splash interrupted and the gull was sucked below the surface. It didn't even have time to struggle. Alec and I remained silent, rooted to the spot until the ship's engine started and the island began to recede slowly but surely into the distance. How far did we travel? I asked. 80 to 100 miles, depending on the tides, Adam replied, looking at me like he hoped I might have some kind of explanation. I didn't, and we both turned to Alec and Hannah as they emerged from the cabin and began to address the crowd on deck. Everyone had gathered that morning after some of the crew had rung the alarm. Since then, every check you could imagine had been run. Engines, GPS, radio. Some people suggested we simply hadn't moved. Others were adamant they knew the feel of a ship underway, but what explanation was there? The garbage patch had followed us. It has to be the currents, Adam muttered quietly as Hannah cupped her hands around her mouth and called for attention. Everyone, she cried. As you know, we appear to not have moved. This has raised some understandable concerns, but I've spoken to the Coast Guard and after checking multiple sources, I can confirm we really have traveled closer to shore. We're on our way home. There was an audible sense of relief that carried through the crowd. Unfortunately, Alec added, the tides have caused the patch to follow us and, as is clear, it has even overtaken us. We don't have an easy route in or out of the island. We can still stick to our current heading, but with so much debris, nets especially, I've made the decision to travel at quarter speed. If something gets caught in the propeller, I want to limit the damage. We're looking at least a week before we get home, Hannah said, clarifying the captain's words. As one, the crowd began to cry out in anger and frustration, thinking of taking a dip. Alec sidled up to me as I smoked a cigarette on deck. It was quiet out with most people having slunk away to their cabins so they could mope in private. But I found it uncomfortable down there. My cabin was below the waterline and the sounds I'd been hearing kept me up. Strange scratches, little taps. They were probably nothing, but that didn't stop the nightmares. I'd rather run a marathon with my ass cheeks sewn shut, I replied. Alec burst out laughing. I don't blame you, he said once the laughter died down. I haven't seen anything like that in my life. Not just the footage, but the shark afterwards. Half its guts were ripped out. How could it even swim? It's like it was. Whatever point Alec was going to make was interrupted by the sound of something heavy and wet hitting the deck. When we turned, we saw a seagull, mutilated and bloody, feathers strewn around the point of impact. Together, we both looked up into the cloudless night sky. Where the fuck did that come from? I snapped. There hadn't been a sound. Not the cawing of gulls or the flapping of wings. We walked over to the bird and were struck by the god-awful smell and the harrowing sight of bone and glistening muscle. Pale yellow fluid oozed out of every open wound, and the bird's anatomy had been ruined by the impact to the point where I wasn't sure what was meant to be a wing, or head, or tail, or torso. I've seen roadkill in better shape, I said. I don't understand what happened to it, Alec replied as he leaned in, one hand clamped over his mouth and nose. Looks like it encountered something corrosive, a toxic chemic. The bird stood up. With what must have been a lot of effort, it tried to flap its way towards Alec, who cried out and stumbled backwards. Both of us swore, and I even burst into a nervous laughter, which I often do when I'm scared. How is it still alive? Alec asked. I squinted at the bird as it continued the torturous journey towards us. It isn't, I said. I mean it clearly. That's its brainstem, I said while pointing towards what looked like a pale white centipede dangling loosely to one side. And where is the beak? The damn thing doesn't have a head. No brain, no life. The bird hopped another step closer. It has to be alive, Alec cried while pointing to the bustling pile of flesh and feathers. It's coming towards us, for fuck's sake. Both of us took a step to the right and the bird turned to keep us in its path. Nope, I said with a quick shake of the head. Nope, not doing this. I stepped forward and kicked the bird as hard as I could, sending it whistling through the air like a shuttlecock before it plunked into the water. Alec and I stared at each other and, after a moment's tension, began to laugh. It felt like the only sane reaction to such a nightmarish encounter, especially since no real danger had been involved. I assumed there had to be a sensible explanation. Like Alec said, a toxic spill perhaps, or some exotic disease. But in the moment, it felt damn good to just laugh after so much time spent afraid. We were still laughing when the ship's engine cut out and the lights failed. It was clear in the morning light that the garbage around the ship was getting thicker. I stared at it through the windows and tried to suppress the strange notion that it didn't want to let us go. Engine's room a fucking mess, Alec hissed as he stepped into the bridge where Hannah, Adam, and I waited. I've got some good guys on it, but the propeller didn't just stop. It was like something yanked the damn thing halfway out the ship. Ruined everything down there. Best we can do is patch the leaks. Any chance of repairing it and getting going again? Hannah asked. Not in the water, he replied. I've asked the Coast Guard to send for a tow. How long will that take? I asked. A day at the most. 3 days later and people were getting anxious. Radio calls between Alec and the Coast Guard were getting terse. I had passed the bridge late one night and heard Alec crying into the headset. What do you mean you can't see us? We're right here. We're in the water. We've sent up flares, given you coordinates, read the stars. Everything. We've done everything you've asked. This isn't some life raft in the middle of nowhere. It's a ship with 30 people on it. It's bigger than most houses, for crying out loud. A day's journey. and we'd be able to see the coast. How can you not find us? In the end, it was Hannah's idea to try the dinghy and head for shore that way. It couldn't hold more than 2 people, but it had let someone get helped and lead the Coast Guard back. Will this thing be able to push through all the garbage? I asked as Hannah climbed the ladder and stepped onto the rubber floor below. It's not far to shore, she replied, and we have poles to help us maneuver around the worst of it. And you got plenty of food. She chuckled. Frank, we won't be gone long enough to need food. None of this is normal, I said while looking at the rolling hills of rubbish. You should be prepared for the worst. You know some of this stuff is thick enough to walk on, she replied. Maybe we'll be able to hike part of the way. She said it as a joke to keep me from harping on about how bad an idea this all was, but it only made me feel worse. Just don't get in the water, I replied. I don't know, just don't. I won't. She smiled just as her companion turned up and began to climb down. I didn't know the woman well, but from what I understood, she was basically Hannah's makeup woman and closest friend. Jen, I think her name was. She saw the look on my face and reached over and squeezed Hannah's hand. Don't worry, Jen told me. I'll take good care of her. But the look on her face spoke volumes about the fear she was trying to hide. Everything ready? Alec asked as he appeared beside me. We only have one more of these, he told Hannah as he pointed to the dinghy. So please look after it, and please come back. One by one the others came by and waved goodbye to the pair of women who all our hopes were resting on. Once the final farewells were said, Alec helped launch the dinghy with a barge pole as Hannah started the onboard motor, and Jen began to paddle. Slowly, the distance between us and them grew, and the little canal they'd carved in the garbage patch was filled by the current. They were about 100 yards away from us when they both turned, smiled, and waved, and we all returned the gesture. And then the dinghy was pulled below. Screams, cries, a loud splash, and before any of us could even begin to react, the garbage had floated back in to cover the space where they had once floated. You can't seriously be thinking of this, I cried as Adam jumped into the spare dinghy and prepped the motor. It's not far, he said, climbing back aboard to grab spare jackets and a lifesaver. We need to check. There's something in the water, I told him. It's just gonna do the same thing to you it did to them. We don't know that, he replied. Adam, Alec said, and something the captain's voice stopped both our bickering. This isn't a good situation to be stuck in, and I don't think this kind of impulsive response is wise. Maybe there is something in the water. What? He stuttered. Because of the shark. You were wrong. It wasn't hunting us. That's like saying you're being stalked by a fucking cow. It's a filter feeder, and Hannah's dinghy must have been broken, punctured maybe, or they hit something just below the water. A rock. I don't know, but they need help, and I can't seriously believe the two of you are suggesting we just sit here and let our friends drown. Adam, I began to say. No, if you won't come with that's fine, but my decision is made. He turned and threw the lifesaver into the dinghy where it landed with a loud thud. Not a second after it had stopped moving, the entire little boat was torn down into the water with such astonishing force that it sent a spray of water 10, 20 feet high. Once the water settled, all 3 of us were left staring into the open space in the trash that had been left by the dinghy, and I caught a glimpse of something pale and reddish sweeping past, a long and thin limb covered in fleshy barbs. Just as swift, also flashed by. The sense of looking at an alien life form was unmistakable. Its skin a rugose pattern of wrinkled flesh, a single black orb of an eye glaring back at us from a torpedo-shaped head, and opposite it, an empty socket where another eye should be. Slowly, the trash bobbed back into place, and our view of what lay below us hidden. Was that a fucking squid? Adam stuttered, his skin paper white. Both Adam and Alec had spent the best part of 8 hours on the radio with the Coast Guard, but we had no luck. The best estimate anyone had was that we were trapped in the garbage patch, and it was being carried away by the current, so that our position and heading were almost impossible to discern. You'd think the GPS would solve that problem, but for the life of us no set of coordinates we gave ever seemed to help. The Coast Guard were often adamant they were flying overhead, but whenever we looked there was nothing to see or hear. People were starting to get hungry. We had a decent supply of food, but we had to start rationing. Slowly, layer by layer, it felt as if the journey was descending into a life or death struggle, and yet I found it hard to take seriously. The ship was huge, luxurious. Many crew whittled the day away in the gym or watching satellite TV, but time was limited. We all knew that. Still, I stood on deck and watched the garbage, unable to shake the feeling something was just out of sight and watching me back. From behind I heard someone approach. I figured it was Alec come out once again to steal a cigarette. I kept my eyes on the water and called out, I wouldn't bother. I'm out. There was no reply. My smile faded and the hair on my neck raised as I registered a wet, fetid stench and heavy-labored breathing completely unlike Alex. Or anyone's, really. This was the wet gurgle of someone whose lungs were filled with fluid, and I turned not sure what to expect, but already terrified beyond measure. It was Hannah. Don't. Alec reached out with his arm to stop Adam touching her. The gesture worked. Adam withdrew his hand. It wasn't hard to see why. Hannah was missing the back of her skull, along with the bottom half of her jaw. But she stood on deck, clothes torn and dripping, her skin a pallid greenish blue, a standing corpse, a walking nightmare. Her eyes were cloudy, but they often fixed the nearest person to talk, which I found to be most frightening thing of all. She was in there, somewhere, or at least something was. She looked like she'd been taken apart and put back together again, and somehow, she still moved, heard, saw. Her nervous system was still firing away, sending signals to a body that should not have been able to respond. Minutes passed and Adam swallowed his fear. He took off his jacket, ignored Alec's weak plea to be careful, and stepped close enough to drape it over Hannah's shoulders. Hannah, are you okay? Where's Jen? Those cloudy eyes turned to him, but her head and body didn't move. I don't think we can expect much of an answer, I said. Hannah, Adam asked. But she only stared, and I became slowly convinced that there was nothing of Hannah left inside that body. Those eyes watched us, sure, but I don't think the images were being relayed back to the woman we once knew. Instead, I felt another intelligence behind them, something malignant. Curious, dangerous, I don't know. For now it felt content to watch us, and that more than anything worried me. She won't move, Adam said as he tried to turn her shoulders away and lead her indoors. She merely shrugged his hands off and continued to flick her gaze from each of us to the other. I pointed to the blood on the deck. It was already coagulated, the texture of rice pudding. No doctor's going to fix that, I said. Just leave her there. Maybe tie her to the gunwale first with a length of rope. I don't think we need her roaming around the place. Hannah was gone in the morning. The rope we tied to her was overboard, and when we pulled it up we found it soaked in a foul-smelling liquid. Even worse, despite briefing everyone and making it clear to stay away, we were down a person on the head count. I wasn't sure how, but I figured the two events were related, and the thought made me shudder. God help the poor soul she'd taken down there with her. By now the atmosphere had taken a dark turn. One by one everyone had come along, usually in groups of 2 or 3 and in bright daylight, to gawk at Hannah during the time she'd been aboard. The effect was haunting, not just the sight of a walking corpse. No, it was the intelligence behind her eyes that was really unsettling. I got the distinct sense she was watching us, counting our number and gathering a sense of who and what we were. I don't think I was the only one to feel that way. After discovering someone was missing the next day, everyone pretty much locked themselves in their cabins and stayed out of sight, and I couldn't blame them. Only Adam, Alec, and I stuck around on deck, and even that was only to try and find a way out of this mess. Not that the others were idle. At least one group of crew had bandied together and were trying to make a raft out of spare material in the hold below. Another were working on their computers to try and get the Coast Guard to us. Meanwhile, the actual sailing crew had fallen in line under one of the engineers and were working furiously to get the engine back online. My plan was a little simpler. This isn't safe, Adam said as I threw another lump of wood onto the pile of timber that floated below. Nope, I replied, it isn't. But that didn't stop him handing me another piece we'd torn from the ship's interior. Alex soon appeared hauling another table from the canteen. I'll break this up, he said. Adam, you get the fuel. Wasn't easy, he replied. The guys down below didn't want to let it go. They're convinced they'll have us up and running in no time. We don't need all of our supply to get to shore, Alex said. If they succeed, great. But I'd like to give this plan a go anyway. Coast Guard know what to look for? I asked, and he nodded. Big plume of smoke. Does it look big enough? I asked after we'd finished throwing the table, one leg at a time, onto the pile below. If the plastic catches, then we should be good, right? Adam said, and it doesn't have to be big, just smoky. Alex surveyed the wood and shrugged. I'd managed to hook a bundle of floating tires and nets and was using that as the base of the bonfire. There's a serious risk we could set this whole fucking patch alight, Adam said, us included, or the smoke could suffocate us all, like being trapped in a wildfire, I added, and both Adam and Alec looked at me with frustration. It was your plan, Adam grumbled. I'm just pointing out this isn't a safe plan. It's just a plan, and I don't think we are at a huge risk. The wood will burn, but everything below, it might char and bubble, might go up a little. but it's also soaked in water. I don't think this whole thing is gonna go up in flame. I mean, it's been here for years. If it could burn, wouldn't someone have just done that already? Just torch the whole patch, if not to get rid of it, then just for fun. Alec sighed. He's right, he replied. I don't think we need what? I stopped what I was doing, pouring gasoline haphazardly over the side of the ship, and turned to look in the direction of Alec and Adam's gaze. They were staring at the strangest damn thing I'd ever seen. It looked like a blimp, almost, but floating in the water. A large round object with a ribbed striated surface. Its skin was pale blue, but the space between each striation blood red. It made me think of some jellyfish, maybe, like a man of war. Only this thing was the size of a small house. It's definitely coming towards us, right? Adam asked, and Alec nodded. I think I sensed the danger early on. In fact, the others probably did too, but we were baffled by this strange shape. It looked like nothing I'd ever seen before, and as it came closer, it carried with it the most god-awful sound you could ever imagine. It was like metal struggling to hold up some impossible weight, a long, drawn-out keening wail that was so loud it drew everyone out of the hold and onto the deck where all of us, a crowd of 30, stared in disbelief. By the time it was close enough to bump against the ship's hull, the sound it emitted was deafening. Alec asked me a question, but I couldn't hear him, so he nudged my arm and pointed at the water below. There I saw that the floating object took on a slightly more recognizable shape. A wrinkled eye blinked. A fin gently stroked through the water. It was a whale, and I suddenly remembered tales of how their floating carcasses could inflate to impossible sizes and pose serious risks to passing ships. All that pressure and rancid meat, a pressure cooker of disease that could send lumps of meat as big as a man hurling for hundreds of meters. I ran and hit the floor just as it went off. I lifted my head to pure carrange. A crowd of 30 people were screaming, Tiveryon soaked top to bottom in blood and rotten fat. White irises glared back at me from faces painted crimson, and dozens were on their knees coughing and retching. But it wasn't just disgust. Something else was going on. Adam crawled towards me, screaming in pain. Get it off, he shrieked as he tried to pull his top off. Get it the fuck off me. I rushed over and helped him pull the t-shirt off, only to reveal something crawling over his skin. It too was soaked in blood and hard to see, with frighteningly long legs with a small disc-shaped body. It skittered out of sight at lightning speed. But it wasn't alone. Dozens of them covered Adam's skin, and they were biting and latching onto his flesh, wrapping legs around his torso like harvestmen against tree bark. I dug my fingers under one set of spidery legs and tore them away, but it wasn't enough. I saw at least 3 of them burrow into his flesh and disappear. I looked around and slowly appreciated the scale of what had just happened. The deck was covered in hundreds of these monstrous sea spiders, and they were making short work of everyone left alive after the explosion. Already there were at least 10 people convulsing on the floor as these plate-sized arachnids tore through their insides. This wasn't my proudest moment, but even as Adam screamed and begged for help, I knew there was nothing I could do except run. So I turned, ready to flee, and saw Alec stood before me soaked in gore. He held a can of gasoline over his head, its contents already dripping through his hair and trickling across the deck. It's inside me. He whimpered as his thumb rubbed the flint of a lighter over and over, trying desperately to get it to ignite. I looked down and saw gasoline spreading amongst my feet. Alec, I said. Alec what? The lighter caught. For a flash there was only a tiny flame hovering over his thumb. Then it finally found the fuel and all hell was let loose. The fire was virulent. People, already soaked in blubber, became living candles that thrashed and ran across the ship, fleeing deeper into the decks below and spreading the flames faster than I thought possible. I was forced to flee to the stern of the ship where the air was clearer. Once there, I gripped the railing and turned to face the fire. People still screamed, but as the seconds ticked on, the agonized cries of those still alive began to thin out as one by one they died out of my sight. My heart sank. It was clear there was no saving the ship. We had life rafts, but they were at the bow and already lost. The last thing I wanted to do was jump into the water, but it was starting to look like it was that or burning alive. I was genuinely contemplating which of the 2 deaths I'd rather when I heard a noise I'd spent days hoping to hear. For a moment I thought it might be a cruel trick of the mind, but it grew with each passing second until I was finally sure of what it was. A helicopter. It circled the ship at some distance, unable to come closer because of the smoke. I could already feel the heat at my back as the fire caught up with me, and I looked down below, convinced that swimming was not an option. But what if no one saw me? I thought. The smoke was growing thicker with every second. What if they left thinking they couldn't help anyone? Hannah had joked that, in places, the island was thick enough to support a person's weight. I looked at the floating garbage below and decided I had to at least try, especially with help so close by. I also needed a way to get noticed, and thankfully a first aid box on the nearby wall contained a flare that I grabbed and stuffed into my pocket. I climbed the rail and awkwardly lowered myself down as far as I could until I finally had to let go and drop the rest of the way. My feet hit something solid enough to stop myself instantly being submerged, but it quickly began to sink into the water. Before it got further than my knees, I jumped onto another clump of floating plastic, and that too began to sink. I quickly realized that if I stayed in one place for even a second, my weight would overcome the island's buoyancy. I couldn't risk the water, not with what I knew. So I ran. I picked footholds at random, and sometimes not very well. At one point, my heel struck the edge of some bundled up net filled with buckets, only for the whole thing to rotate and nearly pitched me into the water, but I had enough forward momentum to be sent hurtling onto what might have once been the fiberglass prow of an old speedboat. I don't know how far I got before I struck the flare and began to scream. I couldn't turn or stop, not even for an instant. If I did, I would sink and drown, or maybe worse. All I could do was keep going 1 foot at a time and just pray that the helicopter saw me as I held the glowing fireball over my head at arm's length. Eventually, my luck had to run out though. The floating island was a piecemeal jumble of old trawling nets and dumped plastic, and I stepped onto what looked like a fairly buoyant clump of bottles and nylon rope, expecting it to hold me up, only for it to give in instantly. I hit the water face first. The flare went out. I tried to kick, to free my leg and keep going, but it was useless. All hope drained. I hadn't had time to hold my breath and already my lungs were burning. Unable to help myself, I looked down. I saw shapes floating in the water, vertical, at rest. People, whales, sharks, squid, turtles, lifeless things that lay in wait, part of something larger, I'm sure. Below them a single shadow too dark to simply be the abyss. Overhead the water churned, the trash parted, and a ray of light flashed past me. It was weak, but it landed on whatever was below. It was big, too big to make sense of, too big to give a shape. In the end, I think I saw only a part of it, and nothing more. It saw me. I know because one of the floating animals, a squid, broke out of its trance and began to glide towards me. It too was a broken, mutilated thing kept alive, an undead monstrosity enslaved by whatever lay below. I suddenly began to regret not burning to death. The squid was 100 yards out when something plopped into the water below me. I looked up into the blinding sun and saw a ladder within arm's reach. I grabbed it, and with a mind that no longer felt whole, I quickly climbed out of the water. I wouldn't bother, the man said as he sat down beside me on the park bench. I snatched my phone into my pocket, irritated that someone had clearly been reading over my shoulder. They won't publish anything in the news. They didn't when I tried. Email them all you want. CNN, Fox, whoever. The only luck I had was on Reddit, and I think that's because most people assumed my story was fiction. Thanks for the advice, I grumbled, and whether I believed him or not, I found myself hastily deleting the email I was writing. It had been a month since my rescue, and I'd already sent dozens to the big news sites. No one responded, and there was no reason to believe the 12th email would magically work. Anyway, he said, I'm Steven. I'm a scientist whose species used to specialize in robotics. What do you specialize in now? I asked. I think, he said, firmly planting the emphasis on the last word. I specialize in whatever it was you saw down in the water. I hope I'm wrong, of course, because what I specialize in, what I saw, last time I saw it, it was trapped. But if you saw it too, out in the open water, well, I don't even want to think about what that means. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, then hit the like. See you guys next time.